So we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. All the way from Baltimore, some of you. Great. So we're in for a treat. We have two really fantastic people in one great show and an equally wonderful catalog, too, that accompanies the book, I should say. So we have Jane Livingston. I hope you know who she is. She's a legend in Washington, a young legend. And she was chief curator at the Corcoran for many years. And she went on to do the catalog raisonné for Richard D. McCorn, and she's curator of great shows, many great shows. And it was a real coup to get her here to work on this project with us. And for the book, she worked with Alex Castro. Is Alex here?
Alex is not.
That's right. So anyway, the book itself is a work of art. So I hope you'll check it out. And we have Rachel Rotenberg, somebody that I knew in Baltimore, and have been following her work ever since. And we are always trying to figure out, okay, how do you do a sculpture show of an artist living in Israel? This seems impossible. But Rachel is really a special, how would you say? You don't take maybe for an answer. Just keep working on it, and you made it possible. And so thank you so much. It's a glorious show, as everybody can see. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Jane Livingston to lead a conversation for us. Thank you.
It's wonderful to see all of you here. It's a nice little crowd. And this is, I think, a huge event. It's, as of now, only going to be here at the Katzen, so I hope you'll tell all your friends who haven't seen it. I think of it as a sort of a landmark in my career. I'm looking at 80 here. So over the last 60 years, I would say there are a handful of exhibitions that I've been fortunate to do, which have been sort of introducing artists to the bigger world, and this is in my top 4 or 5. This work is really lodged in my being. It's interesting, I was at the National Gallery the other day, and there's a lot of sculpture sort of around the place, and there's a huge cedar monstrosity by Ursula von Ryding's work, which is quite imposing. And I thought, boy, I think we could even do better than this. Anyway, I want to focus here and have the conversation sort of go into the whole project as a human of being a creator of objects, and what it's about from one perspective, how it happens, how it gets sustained. It's not easy, it's pretty rare, and I think it's pretty fascinating, especially to have sort of the horse's mouth to talk about it. So I was hoping that Rachel could sort of start by talking about early points in her life when something happened that made her kind of know that she was an artist and that she needed to do something like this. Does this work?
Oh, okay. For me, it was always a very natural process. I grew up in a home, I'm the 5th of 6 children, and my mother is an unusual woman. She grew up, she's first generation, her parents came from Europe, and she kind of brought herself up.
Came to Canada, by the way. We're talking about Toronto.
Toronto, Canada. And she had all these dreams for what her family would be like. She wanted a lot of children, and she wanted them to have everything she didn't have. So she sent us to pottery classes and drawing classes and music and swimming and she just a lot of things just to make sure that we got to dip our fingers into all kinds of creative useful activities. And the other thing about her was that she taught us how to make things. When I was going into first grade, I knit a scarf for myself for the winter, and winters were real winters back then. She made the hat, which was a little more complicated, but I wore that scarf. I remember knitting it on the dock at the cottage in the summertime and wearing it with great pride for a number of years. And so when you speak about the creative process, there's something for a little 6-year-old girl to make something herself and then walk around in the world wearing it. And that, I think, it's just like so deep inside of me. She taught us to crochet and then to knit and then to sew. So by 3rd grade, I was sewing clothing. And sewing is, I think, the first step into sculpture, because you're taking a flat piece of material, you have to lay it out properly on the fabric, and you put it together and it's 3-dimensional. And there are mistakes, and I learned, I learned the patience of having to tear something apart because it wasn't sewn properly and put it back together. The pride of wearing something I thought turned out well, and the disappointment of choosing the wrong pattern or the wrong fabric, and you make it and you put so much work into it, and it's like, eh. And then you go to the next one. And so I really think that's the beginning of making sculpture for me. The other thing we did was there was a school called Central Tech downtown in Toronto, and in the summertime they would have art classes. They were all free. She was always looking for free stuff because camp was out of the question. And they were taught by artists. It was supposed to be for high school and adults. And my mother went into the principal and said, "Can I bring my children?" And he said, "Yes, sign them up. And if you see any inspectors, tell them to go into the bathrooms." I never saw inspectors, but I did go to still life classes and life drawing classes and etching classes. And I started when I was in 6th grade. And that was amazing. I remember there was one teacher I had who taught me etching for drawing. It's cross-hatching. And I remember one day he said to me, "You know, Rachel, if you keep cross-hatching for 25 years, you'll be the best cross-hatcher in the world." And I'm thinking, that wasn't where I wanted to go, but it was, I remember every time I made drawings and I got positive feedback, I believed them. And I remember the next year doing much better and thinking, well, last year that wasn't so good. This year it's really good. So,
I just want to mention one thing about the early years. Rachel came from a tradition, a life, a culture, a history, a world history that isn't necessarily associated with becoming a great visual artist. But art comes from other art genres. I just want to mention 2 of the artists that Rachel mentioned to me. She was exposed to very early in these same years living in Toronto. Her mother taking the kids to things that were free. And apparently the art museum, the main art museum in Toronto at that time, as many museums did in the 50s, 60s, and all the way into the 70s, the sort of, quote, provincial cities had plaster casts of a lot of the great artists. And it happened that Toronto had a permanent exhibition of Greg Crucy, plaster cast of his sculpture. And two of the artists that seem to have resonated early with you, Rachel, are Brancusi and Picasso, because any art museum worth its salt in the late 20th century had Picasso. So I think that's something that's very interesting to contemplate, those two figures in terms of the trajectory. So then we go on from a childhood loving to make things. One little incident that I think also is of interest to me in terms of just your propensity and the way that you go about things is you got hold of yourself of a car early in your life and found that you could fix it.
True. In our household, when something broke, before we threw it out, we would open it up to try to fix it. And that was always good until things had electronic parts, because I know some people can do that, but I don't know anything about it. So when I was in university, my brothers were working on cars, and one of them found an Austin Mini for $50, and my two brothers helped me make it work. I could get it up to 40 miles an hour if I floored it, and that would get me to college, and it got me to my waitressing job. And when I left that waitressing job and I had it up to here, I could floor it, feel like I was racing at 100 miles an hour, and I wasn't breaking the speed limit.
So you knew pretty early on, really, even before I think you became an undergraduate at York University in Toronto, that you were interested in majoring in art. I mean, what you really had, even in your high school years, which is in itself unusual, I think. So York University, and then a professor at York, as any professor anywhere with a gifted student, suggested that possibly New York City and that environment would be a wise move for a little while. So talk about that.
That was my sculpture teacher, and he said, if you ever really want to be an artist, you're going to have to spend some time in New York. Which seemed way like out of the possibility because of the expense of it. But one summer after 2 years of university, I stumbled into a job working for a special effects film company. And I'm not going to go into the whole story of how I found that job, but I ended up making $350 a week, which seemed unbelievable to me, because we're talking 1980, no, it's before that, 1979. So I decided I would work for 6 months and make enough money to go to New York for a semester. And I went to the School of Visual Arts. The work I made that year was pretty awful, but the experience of being in New York, of seeing it's a completely different energy of the students in the art school in New York from what I had experienced at York University. I had always been a serious student and spent endless hours in the studio, which was unusual back in Toronto. But in New York, there were students who were already showing in galleries. They were talking a whole different language. It was an important semester for me. And I was lucky enough to meet my husband in one of those classes.
Her husband, Jean-Pierre, is here with us today. I think it's quite significant and important to sort of note, because I think of Rachel in a way as a self-taught artist. I mean, there's something very individual and very stubbornly independent about the trajectory. But I also am fascinated by the fact that many of the sort of artists that are just naturals and just have to have both on a craft level and a sort of unconscious creative level have a kind of genius. It doesn't take much intense exposure and concentration to really make huge advances. And I'd like you to talk briefly about your experience compared to most artists, a very small amount of time you spent in professional artist workshops. Just talk a little bit about how old you were and who you met met in those situations?
The first workshop I went to was the triangle workshop, but Anthony Caro was associated with the triangle workshop. I had, my 5th child was 1 year old, and I applied and I was invited, actually, that was an invitation. I was a little bit, I didn't know really what to do with the workshop. I was delighted to have 2 weeks in which I wasn't waking up in the middle of the night to take care of children. Didn't have to cook for anybody else. I worked like mad in my studio. I wasn't aware that, for example, years later I met David Furchgoff, and I went up to his office and I said, "Hello, my name is Rachel Rotenberg." He goes, "Yes, I know, I met you at Triangle Workshop." And I was like I didn't know I was supposed to be connecting to people. But I did make some connections, and I got my 2 weeks of working. And the other workshop I went to was the Vermont Studio Center up in Vermont, and I did that years later. I don't know what to say about it, except that I was a little wiser then and spent time meeting people over meals and talking to them and enjoying their company. And there, it wasn't just art, there were writers and poets and a lot more visiting artists every week. I was there for 4 weeks, and there were visiting artists every week.
So I would like to sort of briefly sketch in the rest of the background. And then what I'd like to do for some of this time is to do something we couldn't do in the exhibition. And that's an important aspect of Rachel, the way she thinks and works, which I'll just tell you in a minute. But Rachel, so you go to New York, School of Visual Arts, you meet Jean-Pierre, you go back, finish a master's degree in Toronto, or a BFA in Fine Arts at York, move to New York, and live for a while in the Williamsburg part of Brooklyn, which I think is an important thing, living in a sort of illegal artist loft, and working away and having your first 2 children. But so that's in the very heart of the art scene. So then, at that point, I think for the first time you were just really immersed in the life of the studio, and to some extent meeting other artists and seeing exhibitions. And then I'll sort of skip over that because I do want to do and then to talk about moving from Williamsburg and then for a while to New Rochelle and then to Baltimore, just describe that period.
We needed a different environment to bring up our children, and that was important to. I set up a studio in a 1-car garage, and I just kept working. I probably worked 3-4 hours, 4 or 5 days a week in that 1-car garage, making artwork. My work is so intuitive and working something out from the inside that although I would regularly go to galleries, try to see if I could get a show, go and see artwork, I would say that for the most part, I'm really working on my own. The one artist that I'm always, my jaw drops when I go to see his work is Martin Verrier's work. And
Also
Rotenberg across the street from us before I moved in. He had a studio there. Just the sense of his work, his aesthetic, has always touched me very deeply. I think that my work is, it comes from a place that is, it's not about seeing what anyone else is doing. For me, I always feel like when I'm starting a new piece, it's almost like a blank slate. I don't know what the next piece is going to be. I draw. I actually brought some drawing books if anybody wants to look through them. I'm told they're very, very interesting. For me, they're my way in, because I draw until I find something, and then it's kind of like I massage the drawing in a certain kind of way until I get something that I'd be interested in building. But there's always a place where I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, and I have an idea, something that is pulling me, and I want to jump off and start building it. And I'm going to find something new that I didn't know before, and that's why all the pieces look. I mean, they all have my stamp on them, but they're all different, because it's not so interesting for me to make a variation of the same piece. I kind of know what's going to happen.
So let me just say something about this. So you've seen the exhibition. Has everyone seen the show? Everyone's seen the show. I'm going to give you a mind-boggling concept. Everything that you see started out as a stack of 4x4 cedar planks. And Rachel has never had studio assistants. She's never done anything in any sort of workshops or factories or had any help in crafting these, which is just an unbelievable concept to me. What I would like to do, the reason I say that there's a whole aspect of this that isn't in the exhibition, it can't be in the exhibition, which you will find in the book, and you need to all buy a copy of the book. I must say it's worth it. Yes. Rachel draws, and she draws in bound sketchbooks. Let's look at it. And I must admit that I can't conceive of any sculptor, and including Rachel, I can't conceive of this kind of a body of work without that sort of ancient process of simply taking pencil to paper. And the drawings in themselves, I think, are the only other sculptor whose drawings interest me in the same way, really, in terms of recent output. And have something of the same character is actually those of Eva Hesse. Eva Hesse, as you know, was a flame that died out way too soon. She died very young, but she was a very gifted, very important artist. And the more I think about it, the more I think there's a spiritual contact between you and Eva Hesse. But let's just open up the book a little bit. And I just want to look a little bit, just show the audience. I know, to see maybe stand up.
I think the thing to do is, I brought one book that has some of the pieces that are here, among other things, and all the drawings in between. And then I have the other books here in Baltimore that I brought along too, so that I think when we're done,
Okay.
I'll just go through them.
Okay.
That's much better.
So the work sort of proceeds one after another. Very few works relate very literally to one another, but is it true to say that there's really not an idea that comes without the assist of the graphic idea or the kind of sketching and doodling?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't know where to start because I'm not starting with a piece of driftwood or a tree and then, what does Michelangelo say, just releasing the sculpture from the tree. I think think like that I'm taking these machined pieces of wood and I'm kind of bringing them back to life in a different form.
You know, it's interesting to me that you've never, apparently, you've never thought to make drawings as separate objects. I mean, you've always just used bound sketchbooks. And I'm interested in that. I mean, you don't think of the drawings in themselves as.
It's not that I never thought of it, because I've been reminded many times that it would be so much easier to sell drawings than sculptures. However, when I put, there's something, my drawings are really I think through my drawings. And if I put a piece of paper up thinking that it's going to be something I'm going to sell, it just doesn't, I haven't been able to make it work for me. I don't know why that is. There's something about the book, and it's not precious. I don't know. It works for me, and also, and like I don't finish the drawings like I finish a sculpture. I don't know. They're my diary.
Interesting. I think sometimes it would be wonderful to do a really kind of very ambitious publication, maybe in volumes, that really shows a lot of drawings. We'll see. Another issue that I want to talk about that I didn't write it all about, and I haven't really thought about as much until recently, when I've actually been looking at images of some of Rachel's new work that's not in this exhibition, and Rachel sent me some images. And what it's made me contemplate is that one of the aspects of this work that's very subtle but very important, and I think when Martin Courier becomes more and more salient to this conversation, Rachel is also a very gifted painter and colorist. And the more I think about it, if you look at the work carefully, especially this, what you're seeing is subtle but extremely important paint work, pigmentation. And in fact, it's critically important. It seems to me that for almost a decade, we sort of go to the sort of default palette tended to be what I think of as sort of coppery color, because there's a sort of blue-green that I associate with copper and oxidation that you particularly love and use to enliven. But I feel that you're maybe getting a little older. We see a work here right on this wall that uses paint in a very different way, and that's possibly a direction in which you're going. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I don't think of myself as a painter. I've always used the color as a way to direct your eyes, so that before I've painted the piece, I build the piece and it's working for me, and then I start with the color, because what the color allows me to do is direct your eye to the relationships between the parts of the pieces. You know, early on I was using blues and greens because they contrast so beautifully with the wood, but I have been excited about using new, different colors and being bolder and letting the paint actually be a skin on top of part of the base, like and I'm having fun doing it.
Just one other little observation that I wanted you to be aware of when you go back and look at work. It's fun to think about this. Every once in a while, Rachel seems to have thought, there's something I need here that wood isn't going to quite do. So there are things like, I think at the most elemental level, she's used actual vines, great, sort of thick vines that just grow in nature. And then she has been, I think, self-taught in a whole bunch of other techniques, such as poured concrete and working with metal. There's quite a bit of metal in some of the works, not in here, but there have been, it seems that anything she wants to use, she figures out a way, not only to use it, but to use it use it in a beautifully craftsman-like, permanent, professional way. Nothing's going to stop her from getting what she wants. Although, you know, something about cedar is just sine qua non. Anything else you want to sort of just that's been on your mind that you would be interested to reflect on before we have a few questions?
I think something that has been really important for me, I can start off with, this year I was really honored to become a Guggenheim Fellow. And like the day after, I go down into my studio and my first thought is, oh my God, now I have to make something really great. And then I think, oh no, Rachel, if you don't keep playing and experimenting, you're going to die, or the work's going to die. And but I had to really push that away in order to be free to experiment, to jump off that ledge again into, I know, wherever it's going to take me. And it's like, there's a part of the process actually, it's kind of, when I start and I'm drawing and there's so much potential and then I start building it and sometimes it works beautifully and sometimes it's like falling apart. I've got to speak to the sculptor and go back to my drawing book and find a solution and see where it's going. For example, that very colorful piece, big, large piece in there called Between Heaven and Earth. That was a disaster. I was invited to do an exhibit at the Baltimore Gallery in Jerusalem, and he wanted me to do drawings. He wanted me to experiment, and I did experiment, but it wasn't, like I was trying to think about drawing in air, that's where I go. And I built something that I thought was finished, but when I brought it home, I realized it was really quite awful. And I went back to it over the course of the next year, and I added pieces to it, and I added all that color. That was a real breakthrough for me. Like in order, the drawing on it brings the piece together. And it was, and I brought out oil sticks that I had in my closet, and I was really delighted with how it turned out, and that was a big piece of using more different colors more boldly. So I left that when I got it's not fight with the piece, but I have to work really hard to find where it has to go. It works. When it works well.
It's interesting to me that having been to many artist studios and known a lot of artists, I find it very unusual in the sense that the work is full of stops and starts. I have visited the warehouse in Baltimore where you have quite a bit of work from, spanning probably maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years. And there's really just nothing in that warehouse it's not right. It's not completed. It's not a presentable, unique piece of art. And if there are stops and starts, it really just doesn't show up. And I think maybe one of the factors in that is that when artists are in a very hotbed creative environment, in other words, if artists are living in a neighborhood in New York or any city, and there's a big conversation going on, a lot of socializing, a lot of inner influence, I think those artists make a lot more mistakes because they experiment more from other influences. And there's something about Rachel that maybe is sort of one of the essences of what I'm trying to get at thinking about her, which is that there's just been a certain persistent, sort of isolated, independent, self-reliant, self-referential unfolding of a single sensibility sort of undistracted and not in dialogue, either socially or professionally. And it's resulted in a work that, in a sense, is more like the output of what we call visionary artists or self-taught or whatever. There's no word for it. It reminds me of working on a show called Black Folk Art in America, which was African-American artists who never knew another artist who worked in the South and made incredible things. And there's an aspect, there's a central feeling in these works of a very private, rich, organic development that it's either right or it isn't. There's just not a lot of experimental moments. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. But.
I'm not sure what you mean by not a lot of experimental moments. They're all experimental.
Well, they're all experimental. I mean, unsuccessful, failed experiments.
Okay.
Failed experiments.
I was having this discussion with my husband the other day because he says, you have no failures. And I said, well, I have had some. He said, like, just the fact that you've only had some is the reason to say that you haven't had any.
Pretty remarkable.
There is a responsibility that I feel once I take a piece of artwork, of wood, and start building it up, to take it as far as I can to its completion, if that is possible. Last month, actually, I pulled out a piece that was not working that I built maybe 6 years ago, and I found a solution to it. And it's wonderful, and there was a little bit of, it doesn't matter what it was, but it's working. They kind of, when my pieces aren't working, they feel like they're crippled, and I need to fix them. So it's a little bit painful for me. So I need to work on them and make them as good as I can make them. That's what it feels like.
So, what about questions? What about or comments?
I was just thinking about the process and
All right, great. That's such a good question for me. I have a bandsaw. You know what a bandsaw is? And I have a table saw. And I have grinders and sanders. First thing after I've chosen a drawing is I have to decide which way the wood is going to run, because I want the wood all running in one direction so that when the weather changes, it all moves in the same direction. And then I start cutting and gluing. Sort of roughly around the shape that I'm making, and clamping. So what I do is, this would have been a really rough. When you see the bottom of that large piece there, it's a little bit smoother than what any of my pieces would have looked like before I grind them and sand them down. And that allows me to clamp, get little edges, and also, and then I sand it, and I decide how smooth I'm going to make it, and then I decide where the color's going to go, and then I, somewhere along the way, figure out whether I'm in the right direction.
Don't forget about the glue.
Or the glue, yeah. Yes.
Can we wait, please? Wait.
No, that's okay.
you use like a chisel or anything, because I see like marks.
I use something that's called a lamp slot tool on my angle grinder. It's like a chainsaw on the angle grinder. It's a very dangerous tool. I have hurt myself twice when I was too tired to be working. But it's great, it allows me to get a good rough cut when I'm, the whole time that I'm working, I'm kind of looking for things I want to save. So sometimes I want to save some of those rougher marks and I'll just sand them all out. There are details where I have used a chisel, but power tools are my friends, and yeah. Yes, go ahead.
From concept
Can you wait?
Drawing.
Shush, wait.
You get a mic and
from concept to drawing to assembly, when does size come into it? How do you determine the size?
That comes in with the drawing and the concept. There's two parts to that. One is that the piece itself, somehow I have an intuition about how big it ought to be. The other piece is that even for the drawings, in a certain kind of way, when someone like Jack gives me an opportunity to have a show in a beautiful space like this, I expand the possibilities of what I can dream up. I would never have made any of these large pieces if Jack had not given me the opportunity to exhibit them. The crazy thing about that is that where they will go after this, I am not concerned about at that point. But it's, as soon as he told me that I could have a show here, I built that interior spaces that
Thank you.
room like piece, and that's what I do, because it's really so exciting for me to build larger pieces. I can't actually know how successful they're going to be when I start off, so it's really a deep dive, and it's like, you know, that large piece here, beginning of February, the large one, took me 6 months. I got up every morning excited to go down into my studio to see what was going to happen. I need more big spaces.
I've followed your work for a long time. I've been doing laminated wood sculpture.
I remember you.
Yes, thank you.
What's your name?
Jim Paulson.
Jim Paulson.
At any rate, one of the things that I may be wrong, but it seems to me that your earlier work was less refined in terms of the lamination. Are you now planing the lumber, pre-planing it? Is making a more refined lamination important to you now?
Well, I'm not aware of it being. I would say that earlier on I was ordering wood that was more plain, like you'd get at a Home Depot, if you could get cedar at Home Depot anymore. But lately I've been ordering rough cut for two reasons. One is that you get all the inches you pay for, and then I do cut it and smooth it out on the. Lately, I actually got myself a planer 2 years ago, and then the planer on two sides, and then the table saw on the other two sides. I'm not sure what you're talking about, but
Well, for example, this piece, if you look at the lamination seams, they're all very tight. They're very, very clean. They're very there's no gaps, no.
Now I know what you're talking about. So I cheat. I do try to get it tight, of course. But whatever isn't tight, I fill with wood and glue. And I have always done that. And because I don't want you to be distracted by scenes that are not important to the form.
I watched her fix a piece when it came out of a crate here. It was quite fascinating. It didn't take very long. It was I think Jack would like to join us. Okay, one thing I want to mention that may not be self-evident to you, but that is kind of a miracle. 20th century sculpture has an interesting trajectory, and one of the problems for every great sculptor, really from Richard Serra to Brancusi to, Calder and Smith and everybody, is the issue of the sculpture relating to the floor and to the base. And one of the sculptors, really, except for Martin Curator, that just never seems to even grapple with it, is this one. There's a way in which they sit on the floor that you just don't have the issue of a distracting or a difficult base. And it's really sort of an agonizing question for most sculptors. But the other thing that has become more evident to me as I thought about this too, the other huge problem for any sculptor, if they're working on the wall, is the relation to the wall. These just so naturally just sit where they sit, either on the floor or on the wall. There's an incredibly sophisticated, very hard-won, sort of non-self-conscious and sort of non-representational character about these things. They inhabit a space in the most natural way. You're not aware of them being presented to you, even as a painting would be. They exist in your space. They do what a sculptor wants to do, above all, which is to make objects that just exist and that you relate to in the most natural, the most basically sort of tactile way. Is that ever an issue that's conscious for you? I doubt that it is.
What is conscious to me is, it matters to me how it sits in the world. I think I mentioned to you early on in our conversations, I really don't like it when a sculpture hangs from fishing wire from the ceiling. It's like, what did you think about how this was going to be in the world? I do think about how it hits the floor, of course.
They're like very vivid presences, though, that I think we relate to them as we would to another person almost.
That is for me. That's what I hope for you too.
What kind of paint do you use? What kind of paint do you use?
I use oil paint because I'm putting linseed oil on the wood, and so the linseed oil mixes with the paint, and
Hi, Rachel. I'm really impressed from this talk, thinking that you are working from drawings. You never make models, do you?
I can't say never. There was a year where I used a little bit of, I remember it was clay or plasticine for a couple of pieces. It wasn't so good for me though.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
I'll tell you why. Because with my pencil, I can get an idea down. I can do another variation of it. I can expand a section of it. I can contract. I can push it forward. I can push it back. It's just a whole different process. I really do think with my pencil.
Can you please talk about disassembling your work and what that's like, and then reassembling it again?
You mean taking a piece like this apart? Well, it's great when I have help. This piece, I had never seen it together until we brought it here. Because my studio's only 10 feet high ceiling. And so I built it on the ground, and I didn't stand it up on, and I welded pieces in there to make sure it would work. I did take it outside. I tried really hard to raise it outside, but I couldn't, I put it together, lying down, and then I tried to bring it up with the winch, but it didn't work because I didn't have the winch high enough up. I didn't have a hook up high to hold it. So when they put it together here, it was really exciting. Taking them apart is it's just part of the process. If I'm going to move these big pieces, they have to be built in pieces, and so I designed them. The first big piece I made, I had an exhibit at the Baltimore Museum of Art in 2011, and it was for the Sondheim Prize, and so you get like 6 weeks notice, and I only had time to build one piece for the show, and everything else I had a ton of work. I brought in 25 pieces thinking, because I promised to fill that big room on the second floor, the Fallmeyer gallery. The curator didn't believe I could fill it, so I brought 25 pieces. I put 9 in, and it was full. After that, I built a big piece, and I had a show at Hilliard. And it was only after the piece was finished that I realized I had to get it through a doorway. In a panic, I called them up. I said, could you please measure the doorway? And I fit in by 1/4 of an inch on this. And from then on, I decided if I'm going to build a big piece, it's going to come apart.
Rachel, I'm really glad that you're addressing the practical aspects of making your work and everything involved with the logistics of putting together the show and just all the problems you had to solve to do this show. I mean, people really don't, I mean, making the work is one thing, and the work is so beautiful, but I think almost equally beautiful is the way you were able to bring this show here and put it together. And, you know, Jane came in and you were on the floor repairing work, you know, and you fit everything into a shipping container, crossed the ocean, and, you know, somehow managed to, you know, reassemble everything. I mean, it was really, really an impressive feat.
Reassemble what they had packed properly.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
No, it's an amazing thing.
I know I've asked some questions, but I just have 2. One being, do you ever use color in your sketchbook for when you're like working
I don't. There's maybe a tiny little bit of color on sketchbooks, but no. I'm using an HB pencil and an eraser. Both really important.
Yeah. I also was wondering about the wood. So there has to be some sorts of wood that are more malleable than others. So I don't know, to use cedar. Have you tried it?
So when I was a student at university, there was a graduate student there who was a friend of mine who was using 4x4 cedar. I saw how he was laminating. I didn't start doing that for a few years afterwards, but cedar it's a very good building material. They used to build houses out of it, and then it got too expensive, and they used pine, and pine twists and turns, and it's not so good. So cedar is good for, it stays straight, it's got anti-bugness. I'm sure there's a word for that. It's a medium density wood, so it's not too soft, but it's not too hard, it's not so heavy, it's not too light, it doesn't crack easily. It's easy on my tools, it's not so heavy. Like some of these pieces, I can lift most of this work.
One thing I just want to mention briefly, I think when we think of pieces of this scale and this sort of genre, we often think of works in a garden or outdoor pieces, sculpture garden pieces, or works in public spaces. And I did ask Rachel about the possibility, how would she feel about having something like this, for example, in bronze, that could be permanently outdoors. And she said, well, it's a question of economics.
Do you have another question?
It's not a question. I don't know how to say it, but it's sort of confusing. So that's to say, like, you prefer a middle ground of rhythms and softer words or harder in that sense of the word.
Could you repeat that?
Thinking about middle ground.
Get your mouth.
Could you repeat that? We can't hear it.
By your mouth.
You would prefer, like,
So
a middle ground
So,
of softness or
so like something like a walnut or a cherry or a maple, they're much harder woods. They're hard on your tools, they're heavy. They're also beautiful woods, and there are places, there's a piece I had in there, a horizontal piece, and the middle part of it, I used a piece of much denser wood because the cedar wouldn't carve well, that kind of carving. Where I did use a chisel, by the way. So there are places and times to use denser wood.
Yes.
A lot of good information about the process and the angst and going through these things, starting with the drawings. In the end, they're very quirky and have, to me, a lot of kind of relaxation and humor to them as I put myself into them. I wonder if that intuition comes as you draw, then a tremendous amount of energy and maybe months before you resolve something, but is there a thought about just the quirkiness, or seeking the quirkiness and looking for the humor in those juxtapositions?
So it's wonderful to me that they are that way. I have a sense of myself as being a really normal person with not all that much to say. I raised 5 children. I've done that, and I'm really, really practical in my life. I'm really practical in my life. And then I go into my studio, and I'm not looking at the clock, and I'm not thinking about what this is going to be good for. My brother once said to me, "Why don't you make something practical, Rachel?" And I was like, so the process, the intuitive process that I go through allows me, I feel like it allows me to even discover something about myself I didn't know. I look around this room and I wonder where this is coming from. It's surprising. It's delightful. That it delights other people is amazing. It's exciting. It gives me so much pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, maybe we'll have a little bit of time to again take in these extraordinary, quirky, wonderful, let's call them beings. Thank you.
Thank you.